I modeled some geometric fir tree shapes in Fusion 360 and printed them out in separate parts that I thought would be easy to cover in carbon fiber cloth. I want to do a mix though of cloth plus the individual strands, so I didn't print out any trunks. Those I'm going to create separately using the strands, and then these will be covered with a twill. I brushed a coat of epoxy resin over each of the pieces and allowed that to set up until it was mostly cured but still a little bit tacky. It would have been better if it were slightly more tacky. I left it just a tad too long, but if it's too tacky, then it makes a big mess when you try to put the carbon fiber on because it will just get stuck to your gloves and be all over the place. To make the patterns for the carbon fiber, I used my 3D model to create some flat templates. I used a twill weave carbon fiber that's stabilized, so there are tiny little webs over one side that prevent the fibers from fraying as much, so it makes it a lot easier for working with small parts like these. I still did leave a bit of an overhang so that the part that does fray can just be trimmed off later on. My goal was to have the weave all going in the same direction. However, there were a couple of these branch sections where, by mistake, I put the carbon fiber on facing the wrong way, and once you stick that down, there's not really any going back. So there's a couple of branches that face the opposite way. Oh well. I was thinking about if it might be better to do each panel as a separate piece, or try to stretch a single piece over it without having a seam, but in the end, doing a version with a seam seemed like a great starting point, so I just picked that and went with it, and then I can change my mind later on in a future project if I don't like this one. Once the resin was cured, I used scissors to trim the edge. Carbon fiber is actually pretty easy to trim with scissors when it's just one thickness like this. Now if there's a bunch of resin on a spot, then that's what's hard to cut through. I trimmed the top and the bottom, although the top's not really going to show except on the very tippy top piece of the tree. Mostly I used scissors, but I also grabbed a craft knife to trim up some of those seams that were a bit messy. I then glued each of the trees together using some epoxy. There's a bit of an extension at the top that lines up with the next piece so that they all fit together pretty easily. There's a bit of wobble, and of course they all look just a tiny bit off since the carbon fiber was really imperfect. This was a first attempt, and it didn't stick down quite as well as I would like along those seams. It's a bit hard to get it laid down properly on such small pieces, I found, even with having the epoxy sticky coat down first. Maybe there's a better way. We'll see. Again, this is a first attempt, so I'm just trying to get one version down so I can get that experience under my belt and then come up with a better version. I could spend all day just trying to think of all the possibilities, or I could just try one, get that experience, and make better decisions later on based on what I learned. I want to put all these trees onto a base, and I was thinking it'd be cool if the trees' roots were sort of grabbing onto something that's maybe like a rock, but I'm going to make it a green rock for some reason. That seemed like a good idea. To make the rock, I printed it out in Tech G Filament, which is translucent. I printed it in 2 halves to make it easy to print, and then I also added a whole bunch of strings inside using a 3D printing pen. This is like the worst nightmare if you were trying to print without strings, but in this case, I want as many strings as possible to help diffuse the light and make some interesting root-shaped patterns inside of the glowing stone. And I also cut out a hole because I'm going to put this LED inside. I used a wood burner to stick all of those edges together all the way around the oval shape. You can see the print lines on this, and I'm not too worried about that right now. I think that might look cool through the resin. So I'm just going to leave that on this version and see how it looks in the finished product. To make the stumps, I used a 3D printing pen with more of that same filament and built up a trunk shape where I thought each of the trees should go based on my 3D model, where I sort of mocked up the placement. I extended the trunks up high enough where I thought that I'd have enough clearance once I add the tree branch sections on top. And then I also added in some roots using the 3D pen. I let these string down a bit on the bottom so it looked like the roots were reaching down for the ground past this stone. And then I'm going to cover those in carbon fiber later on, but I just wanted to get the basic shapes put in place and blend those trunks into what will become the carbon fiber roots. To make this look more interesting and help diffuse the light, I added a bunch of epoxy resin over top. And I dyed it different shades of green using a selection of epoxy resin dyes. It took quite a bit of the dye to get the resin a rich enough color that it's going to help to hide the bare bulbs of the LED and also give it that nice green glow. So I just kept adding dye until it looked dark enough, and I didn't have any problems with it curing, so I guess it wasn't too much. Next, once that was cured, I started building up those trunks with some carbon fiber tow. This is just a matter of trimming sections that are wet with the resin and placing them so that the trunk blends down into the tree roots and it starts to look a bit more realistic. I like the contrast of the black carbon fiber onto this green. It looked a bit too bright and gaudy at first, but now that I'm getting all of this dark carbon on there, it sort of tones the whole look down. I used a thinner carbon fiber tow to place the roots. They're a bit hard to stick down in place. They don't want to take that curved shape. They would much rather stay more straight. So I just had to fiddle with it until I got them to look more like tree roots and less like pieces of carbon fiber. I mostly followed the lines that I had already set up with the 3D pen. I didn't cover every single one because it just started to look a bit too cluttered. I just picked out the roots that looked like they would be nice, highlighted in the carbon fiber, and coated those. Once that was cured, I thought that it still looked a bit too bright. I was still seeing too much of the LED through the filament once I tested it. So I mixed up some resin that had a lot more blue in it. I just dumped that inside and moved the piece around to spread the resin throughout the entire center. I then left that to cure upside down so it wouldn't all just drip back out. And I did rotate it a couple of times throughout the cure process to try to get it spread more evenly. To install the trees onto this base, I added some foam to fill up the empty space inside so that it would have something to rest on top of each of those trunks. And I did also trim off the sharp edges on the trunks so that they would sit flush against the foam inserts. I staggered the heights so that the trees would all fit on and overlap slightly, and I left the glue to cool down while making sure that the pieces stayed in position. The light just sets inside. I haven't permanently attached it because I'm not sure that I like this light. I think it might need to be a bit brighter. In the end, this didn't quite match the way that it looked in my head. No surprise since it's just first attempt. I'm not sure that I like the woven carbon fiber for the leaf section. I kind of prefer the trunks and would have liked to just continue that carbon fiber tow all the way up and create all the different branches. Also, it might look nice if the carbon fiber on the branch sections were more glossy or maybe even had some drips of resin like there was snow melting or something. I think the roots could look a bit more natural and maybe wrap all the way around. And it does need a sturdier base since this is quite wobbly. I could explore so many different options on this first version, but I think it might be more productive to do completely new projects rather than spending a whole bunch of time trying to perfect this first version. I mean, when is the first version ever going to be the best one, really? I think I'd rather spend those extra hours applying what I've learned from this project and creating something new. And I think I can take this concept in some interesting directions in future. Hope that you enjoyed this project. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time.